useless.
Hello and welcome to Conversations with Dr. Greer. This is Dr. Stephen Greer, and I'm the director of the Disclosure Project and CSETI. And also, we're, of course, as you all know, launching this film, Sirius, which should come out in the spring of this year. So we're wrapping that up. And I'd like to thank the folks at the World Puja Network for hosting us here every 2 weeks to bring you up to date around the world with all the projects that we're working on. We have a new website where all these projects are being put under one roof, as it were, at least internet roof, and it's SiriusDisclosure.com. That's SIRIUS disclosure.com. So you can go there and see what we're doing with the film, see what we're doing with the new energy effort, disclosure, and the CSETI contact operations and programs. So I'm very excited today to have with us someone who is, I think, probably the most important and special guest I've ever had on this program. And he's a man of enormous integrity who has been involved and assisted with some of the very important work Disclosure Project has been doing, and has been a great friend and ally for over 20 years. In fact, I believe we met in 1991. And his name is Commander Will Miller. He's a retired U.S. Navy officer. He is someone who has worked very closely with me to help bring the information about the UFO and extraterrestrial issue to some of the highest-ranking members of our military in setting up briefings and meetings here in the United States. And he's also been, I think, the most important advisor to the project in helping us understand how the system works and what the reality is versus the perception out there in the public about secret programs, top secret programs, and as we'll get into, unacknowledged special access projects. So I'd like to thank Commander Miller for being with us today. Thank you, Will, for being here.
Well, you're very welcome, Steve. It's a pleasure to talk with you.
Well, why don't you? It'd be great if the folks listening would get a sense of the lay of the land. I think one of the things I want people to understand is how the government works, or as we get further into this hour, how the government doesn't work on certain issues, but how it's designed within the military and intelligence community in terms of classified programs. I wonder if you could just speak to that, because I know you have a great knowledge of it.
Sure, and there are a lot of misconceptions about secrecy and classification, particularly when it comes to this subject. First, there are many folks that would say, well, nothing should be classified. The government should be able to open all of their files and give us anything we want. And obviously, there is a need for classification, legitimate classification, for some programs to protect national intelligence information and information, the disclosure of which would cause grave harm to the nation. We would not have wanted the Germans to get all of the information about how to build an atomic bomb. That could have been a grave problem in changing the outcome of World War II. But that said, you frequently hear folks talk about, well, this program must be above top secret. And actually, there are only 3 levels of classification in the military: confidential, secret, and top secret.
Right. And
those being made by an individual, by the classifier, based on certain criteria as to what kind of harm their release would cause to the government. And there are, however, handling caveats, things like eyes only, so you can have secret eyes only information. Secret ORCON, which is originator controlled. In other words, only the person who created the classified information controls who gets to see it.
Right.
Or ESI, especially sensitive information, or even no foreign dissemination. And then, of course, you hear the term cosmic top secret thrown around, and the cosmic classification is a NATO unique classification. But all that aside, there's a major issue as to how secrecy is maintained in the military particularly with respect to what we call special access programs, or SAPs. Now, you can have special access programs that have any number of classifications. Most of them are top secret, with some of the handling caveats that I mentioned earlier. The way they work is, if there is a program that the information is so sensitive that only a few people need to know about that, then there is a special access program created. In other words, you have to have special access to have knowledge of that program. So even if you have a top secret clearance, you may not have access to that particular SAP because you don't have the need to know. All right? And there are pros and cons to having such programs. One of the pros is that you can keep the information very close to the vest, so to speak. You can control who knows about it. But at the same time, many times you don't know that there are others working on other special access programs that may have information that would be helpful to your program. And because the two don't intermingle,
that's right.
You many times are denied access to information that in your SAP would be helpful to you, or to technologies that would be helpful to you. So that's kind of how special access programs work. And in general, once you get into that line of classification, you are generally available for other special access programs. In other words, once you are read in, you sign the documents, and many times sign your life away forever in terms of never being able to release that information as long as you live. So then we move to another category of USAPs, or unacknowledged special access programs. Now, things get kind of interesting here.
Right.
The fact that they are unacknowledged, and Congress, by the way, has oversight of all classified programs. Supposedly, even over unacknowledged special access programs, there is supposed to be one person who is cleared to the highest level to follow and track that USAP. Unfortunately, that doesn't always happen.
Right.
So you have a program, the existence of which is totally unacknowledged. In other words, nobody knows about it except the people that created it and those that are read into that unacknowledged program. That can lead to misuse, and it can lead to the improper classification of programs and activities that should otherwise be available. So it is within the area of unacknowledged special programs where we would most likely find information on the unidentified flying objects, extraterrestrial intelligence, and related technologies.
And this is one of the things that we have from information from people that are Disclosure Project witnesses that began in the 1950s. In fact, I was given a date by a senior scientist at the Naval Research Labs. It was October 1954, where some of this information went into compartments that were in the unacknowledged arena that have become so developed but have become also so powerful and off the radar of the oversight of Congress or the President, and as we'll get into this discussion, some of the senior members of the military and intelligence community, that they pretty much have gotten up and sort of like a Frankenstein and walked off the table. And this was what I encountered when, in during the Clinton years, I briefed President Clinton's first director of Central Intelligence, the CIA director, who informed me that he and the President had attempted to find out about this subject of UFOs and had been told nothing, and in fact had been told nothing existed or denied access. And subsequently, I know that someone who was encouraging me to begin the Disclosure Project back in the 90s actually admitted that subsequent to that and to my briefing, the CIA director, this is the man who works for the CIA, went over and began to discuss that problem of this sort of over-compartmentalization. And it harkens to mind what President Eisenhower said when he said, beware the military-industrial complex. And, of course, he was a very patriotic, conservative Republican member of our presidential lineage, who was, of course, also, for those you don't know, a 5-star general, which, of course, we don't have anymore. But and we don't have a 5th star for generals at this point. But Eisenhower, when he said beware the military-industrial complex, it is my understanding it was because it was between 1954 and the end of his administration in January of 1961, just before Jack Kennedy took office, that a lot of these programs really got legs, and it was because they figured out a great deal of the science and technology behind the energy and propulsion systems behind what the public would now call UFOs, although that's not what they were called back then. They were actually called flying saucers, extraterrestrial vehicles, et cetera, and so on. So that's just some background historically for people to understand, how serious the issue has become.
Yes, and as you mentioned, many of these special access programs, and particularly unacknowledged special access programs, who draw their money ultimately from the taxpayers. It comes through the defense budget.
Right.
USAPs many times act as little mini vacuum cleaners, sucking up end-of-year money from other programs, and so it's very difficult, if not impossible, to trace their sources of funding. But when you get into the subject of UFOs and extraterrestrial intelligence, there are two perceptions in the public. One is that, the highest leaders in the military obviously must know about this,
right,
and must have access to all information. And what we have found is that is absolutely not the case. In fact, to ensure that those leaders in high levels of military and civilian positions, such as the head of the Defense Intelligence Agency, he would be protected from knowledge on this particular subject, so that if there was a Freedom of Information Act request, a FOIA request, or a congressional inquiry, he could, with perfectly clear conscience and veracity, go before any of those bodies and say, I have no knowledge of that subject. And he'd be completely honest. He did not. He'd be protected. However, somewhere in his organization, there would be people who would have great information and be the custodians of that. Many times some of the senior civilian employees who have continuity as the military leaders come and go.
Yes, I call it the permanent bureaucracy that exists, as opposed to, say, the CIA director that comes every 2 to 4 to 6 years, or the head of the Defense Intelligence Agency, which, for those of you who don't know, it's like the CIA within the Pentagon. It's very large, but it's its own intelligence and the analytic and gathering entity for the Pentagon, as opposed to the CIA. And what I have found, and of course in direct meetings with a number of these figures, is that they are not lying when they say, we honestly don't know anything about this subject. And in fact, when we have made inquiries, we have been told nothing. And in one case, when I had a document that had some of the code numbers and names for some of these unacknowledged special access project compartments from the National Reconnaissance Office, there was a certain admiral, I remember, had found one of those and basically was told, we know who you are, but you don't have a need to know, and we're not going to tell you anything. And this gets into the question of what I call legal secrecy, which would be the kinds of things that were being tapped into by the WikiLeaks people, and things that are sort of ordinary, and illegal secrecy or unconstitutional secrecy, of which there have been many, many books written, and which becomes of great concern in a democracy in terms of who's minding the hen house and who's minding the store if there's not this oversight. And if I can just give one example, I recently met with a man in Washington who's an auditor for one of the big three auditing accounting companies that audits contracts for the government, and he was assigned to audit Northrop Grumman, which is my uncle's old company. And he said basically there were programs that even though he was cleared to do all of this, they basically said, you don't have a need to know the details of anything we're doing. So basically, he would just rubber stamp what they were telling him, what they were doing with the money, and where it was going. And so exactly where are the checks and balances in a system like this? And this is why back in, and I don't know if you know this story, Will, back in 1994, it was this time of year, and after I had met with the CIA director and I was meeting with some people up in New York, with the UN, I was asked to go to a meeting at the Senate Appropriations Committee, and the chief counsel for the committee at that time was a guy named Dick D'Amato, no relation to the Senator D'Amato, but he worked with Senator Byrd of West Virginia, who was chairman of the Senate Appropriations Committee, and we were sitting in the big chamber with the huge table and the brass name tags at each senator's seat, and we were meeting with a think tank head and myself and this man who had a top secret clearance and also had subpoena power on behalf of the Senate Appropriations Committee. And he told me that he had seen evidence that things were going on related to the ET and UFO subject, but that with a subpoena power and a top secret clearance on behalf of the committee that wrote the checks for the U.S. government, he could not penetrate them. And he looked at me squarely in the eyes and he said, Dr. Greer, you're dealing with the varsity team of all what he called black projects. And he says, good luck. And then he informed me of something which at the time I thought couldn't be. He says, well, we have concluded that there's upwards of $100 billion a year that we have no idea where it's going. Now, this is in 1994, 19 years ago. And of course, that's when $1 billion was more than $1 billion today. And if you connect the dots, then going forward a decade or 8 years later, when Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld, the day before 9/11, said, well, there's about $2.3 trillion, with a T, trillion dollars missing out of the Department of Defense budget over the last few decades, that we really don't know where it's gone. And, this is the kind of thing where now you're talking serious money and serious power, and who's overseeing this?
Right. Well, that's an interesting point. When I worked at Atlantic Command, I worked with a number of operational programs, and those programs were supported by many other agencies, one of them including the National Security Agency, NSA. Well, I worked in programs and budgeting and technology support, and one day I was given a sheet of paper and asked to approve about 5 classified programs that just had code names, like Blue Flash or Wonder Spear, and so I said, well, what do these programs do? And they said, oh, I'm sorry, you're not cleared to have the need to know. You don't have the need to know, but trust us, these programs support your operations. And I said, look, I can't certify these, I can't justify these, I can't sign off on them unless I know what they do. And there was a big row. I said, look, you tell the director of NSA that Atlantic Command's not signing off, at least not in my office, until we have someone read into those programs. And sure enough, they sent folks down, and we sat down behind closed doors in a secure intelligence facility, and they read us in. We had to sign many papers, sign our lives away once again. But we found out, the programs actually did do something for us, but I wasn't going to begin to vouch for that until I knew what the heck they were, So not everybody does that.
Right.
Yeah. But, that leads to another area, and if you read some of the literature and listen to what many people in the public believe, is that the military doesn't really take the UFO subject seriously. And it has been my experience, and yours as well, that they take it very seriously.
Oh, yeah.
In fact, I'm going to talk about some specific examples, if you'd like, meetings that we have had where the subject has come up, and there has been not only great interest but great discussion. I thought I'd start back in '89. I don't know I've ever mentioned this particular situation to you. I worked as a liaison to U.S. Space Command and had the chance to spend about a week inside Cheyenne Mountain. It's called a Cheyenne Mountain Air Force Station, even though it's in the heart of a mountain.
Right.
With lakes big enough to water ski on, the vault doors, the 3-story buildings on springs, a little rock and roll in World War III, they hoped. At any rate, we had access to the large tracking consoles in the Space Command Center there. And there were 54 categories of objects that were tracked. And the Navy Lieutenant Colonel who was taking us around had top secret compartmented access clearance. He could basically talk to the Almighty, And he said, "Is there anything you'd like to see?" I said, "Well, I see you've got a button here. You press that, and it says foreign airline." So he pressed the button, and sure enough, I always saw the Lufthansa flights going into New York, and it was very interesting. He said, "Anything else?" I said, "Well, yeah, let's look at 54, category 54, UFOs." And so he pressed the button on the console, and immediately was displayed access denied.
Wow.
And I just thought that was really interesting, because here was a guy who supposedly had clearance to look at anything, and but not this.
Not that. That's correct. Right.
Yeah, we can move on to a few years later in '92. I had the chance to talk with the then Director for Intelligence, the J2 at Atlantic Command. And this was just an informational briefing that I was giving him as a courtesy to let him know some of the work that CSETI and had been doing worldwide on the subject. It was something I thought he would not generally have access to, even though he was a Director for Intelligence. And we got to talking about he was also a submariner. And I asked him at one point, I said, "Admiral, have you ever come across any information from submarine intelligence units of large aircraft carrier size underwater objects going at speeds approaching Mach?" And of course that's quite an unusual occurrence. And he looked at me, he said, well, there's some strange things reported from time to time, but there are always those computer glitches. And then we just went on to something else. I thought that was kind of interesting.
Yes, right.
Yeah,
that's
yeah.
Right. Oh, that's an anomaly. We won't talk about that one. Yeah,
right. Yeah. It's there may be such things happening, but obviously that's just a computer glitch.
Right. We have one of our disclosure witnesses who was actually on a submarine when they went out on a mission, and there were a couple of underwater of these objects their mission really was to go under and track, but they used the euphemism magnetic anomalies underwater, and so they went and so they were looking for these magnetic. Sure enough, one of these things came by, and there were then two, and they got on either side of this nuclear submarine and took its drivetrain offline. Basically, they couldn't go up, down, forward, back, nothing. And at one point, they tracked one of these objects going underwater at 450 knots. Now, to give you an idea, that's basically the speed of a jet in the air, but this is in water. Which is 1,000 times denser than air, or whatever it is. But he said with no wake.
Yes.
So the way these objects operate, it creates a space-time bubble that it moves through that doesn't then disturb the water or the air. And he said that's quite obvious. It was quite fascinating. So sounds like an ice cream truck. That's
a incoming call I've just dispatched with. I'm sorry.
Oh, so that's all right. Yeah. So, it's very interesting. Yeah, so, there have been some other meetings as well. It'd be great to hear.
Yes, and I used to, in my work at Atlantic Command, I used to have to go up to the Pentagon frequently, and took the helo up there, landed in front of the Pentagon on the helo pad there from Norfolk to D.C. And I would generally stop in to see a former director of intelligence that we had, and he was now the Joint Staff Deputy Director for Intelligence. And so I made an appointment to see him, and I thought it was about time that I brought up the subject of some CSETI work, particularly because when I was working at the time as your military advisor, we were trying to find someone in Department of Defense with whom, or some entity in DOD, with whom we could deconflict any field operations we were doing, because at the time DOD was doing a lot of counter-drug operations things, and here CSETI had teams of people out with high-powered lights and lasers, and we didn't want to interfere with any government drug bust and let them know about what was going on. So I talked to the Admiral. I said, Admiral, on another subject, suppose that there was a group of retired and active duty military, former astronauts, senior technical people, and other civilians who were in fact doing field work, communicating with and vectoring in extraterrestrial spacecraft, and they wanted to deconflict those operations with DOD. Who would they talk to? Just hypothetically, of course. And the Admiral's eyes narrowed, and he looked at me and said, this isn't hypothetical, is it, Will? I said, well, sir, honestly, it's not. He said, I used to know who those people were that you would talk with. Give me 24 hours, and I'll get back to you. So I went back to Norfolk, and sure enough, the Admiral's aide called me. He said, here's a number for a lieutenant colonel in the Air Force Intelligence Command at the time, called AFINT, and call him, and he will begin to put you in touch with some folks. So I called this colonel, who, when I got him on the phone, assured me he was very uncomfortable and not at all happy about being directed to talk to me on this subject, but that I was to call the director of the Foreign Aerospace Science and Technology Center, FASTIC at the time, out at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, and I could go from there. So I called this bird colonel out there, and as you may remember, we set up a meeting, you, me, and I think it was Dr. Scott Jones at FASTIC, Foreign Aerospace Science and Technology Center, to brief them and on what CSETI was doing, and also to ask if there was some entity with whom we could deconflict our operations. And that meeting was very interesting.
Oh, yeah.
Because we gave them a couple of briefing books. The director was then transferred. He told me to contact his successor. He was transferred within 30 days, and basically the minutes of the entire meeting went into a black hole, into the Mathmos. So the information surfaced once again many years later, I understand, at White House staff. But I was pleased to be able to set up a meeting at the Joint Staff there, J2, the Director for Intelligence, back in '97.
Yeah, and what Commander Miller is referring to is the head of intelligence for the Joint Chiefs of Staff, although they call it Joint Staff, right, at the Pentagon.
Right. Yeah, and that was a meeting with you and me, and I think Ed Mitchell was there,
right.
Astronaut Ed Mitchell, among others. And the Admiral took this briefing with the same level of gravity and interest as he would any other national security, national intelligence matter. So when folks say that the military is not interested in this subject, that is obviously not the case and has not been our experience.
No, and in fact, I remember that we were slotted for a certain amount of time, and he kept turning to his aide saying, cancel this, cancel. It kept extending because he had tremendous interest in what was being shared.
Yes. It was also a little interesting aside. As I was leaving, the Admiral's aide turned to me and said, the subject of Majestic MJ-12 came up, and there's been a lot of debate as to, whether that's real, whether it ever existed. And he said, we know it exists. We here at the Intelligence Directorate for the Joint Staff just don't have the need to know what they do. Right. And I found that to be a very interesting statement.
A very important statement. And, of course, if you look at this National Reconnaissance Office I have from the early 90s, it lists specifically MAJIC, MAJIC, and cosmic ops, and various code numbers and code names on this document. And we know it's a legitimate document. And so it was basically warning of a security breach at the Nellis Air Force Range out Pahoot Mesa, S12, S4, S3, Groom Lake, where a lot of very classified research and development and aerospace activities take place related to all of this. The public has incorrectly called it in Area 51, but nobody calls it that. Who's in the know? But the point being that this document actually has that on the distribution for this alert for a security breach out at that range, and MAJIC was one of them. So,
right. One of the other more interesting meetings that we had in the Pentagon was with the director of the Defense Intelligence Agency, and we didn't think we were going to put that meeting together until we got some briefing material hand-delivered to the director, and suddenly I received a call, said, look, not only do we want to meet with you, we'd like to expedite the meeting. So you and I went up to the Pentagon and met with the director, and I think it was two of his staff members.
Right.
And he received the briefing material that we had with not only great interest, but also shared some personal information that I won't go into now, showing that he had a great personal interest in the subject as well as a professional interest. But as head of DIA, he had asked his staff, his many minions and other related agencies, if he could get some background material on the subject of UFOs and extraterrestrial intelligence. And he said, as he got up from his desk, he said, and gentlemen, this is the only thing that I received. And he walked over to a bookshelf and he took down a little model of, a tiny little alien play figure.
Right, an E.T. doll, sort of.
An E.T. doll, yeah, that was it. And, it was kind of sad. Once again, we explained to him that, in his position, he would be protected from the knowledge of this subject. Right. That didn't go over very well, I might add.
I do remember us commenting that, because I have a couple of disclosure project sources who have been tasked with this issue, and particularly have seen some of the images taken by some of our satellites or birds that we have up there of these objects. And so certainly there are people in that command, even though he was a 3-star general, I believe, was not being given the information, but there are compartmented operations at DIE that in fact do deal with this subject, but they just weren't telling him. And I remember when we made the point that there were certainly operations that we knew about, that I had talked to people about, that had dealt with this issue at the Defense Intelligence Agency at the Pentagon, but that there were people in his command who just weren't letting him know about it. There was a visible stiffening of the body language of the colonel who was at the table.
Yes. Yeah. Yes, I remember that. He was sitting over taking notes in the back corner.
I would say he was not amused at that revelation.
No. Through a former NSA contact of mine, I had the chance to meet with a high-level retired National Security Agency senior civilian. And this gentleman, we talked about the subject of UFOs and, again, whether any government agency either had information on the subject or had interest in. And he revealed one tidbit of information I found very interesting. He said within NSA, there was a document known only as the document, and it was on the subject of UFOs and extraterrestrial intelligence. And it was so highly classified that only the director himself and perhaps one or two other people were actually able to view it.
Right.
Its existence was widely known, but again, very, very close hold information.
Right.
So.
Right. Extremely. Yeah. Well, and what's interesting is that, you know, when Jimmy Carter was during the transition from the election into when he took office, they always have a meeting with the incoming president and the current and perhaps outgoing director of the CIA, who at that time was George H.W. Bush Sr. And Carter wanted to be briefed on this, and Bush told him, I am not going to tell you anything about this. And this is when Carter tried to set up the White House study group on the issue, and that was eventually shut down. And one of Carter's friends, Jimmy Carter's friends, in fact, we just saw Jimmy Carter, at the inauguration last week or 2 weeks ago, and he was at this time he was in Spain. Signing guitars from a classical guitar factory with this classical guitarist who's a supporter of the Disclosure Project, and they were auctioning them off with his signature or autograph from the president to raise money for the Carter Center there in Atlanta. And afterwards, there were about 20 people at dinner, and the president was there, and someone said, what was it like being the most powerful man in the world? And President Carter said, well, I don't think I was that man. There were things that I didn't have access to that I knew existed and knew were going on. And someone said, oh, really? Things like what? UFOs, and with a sort of a chuckle, sort of a derision, sort of a ridiculing laugh. And Carter stopped them and said, yes, that and more.
Yeah.
And you could have heard a pin drop in the room, according to my friend who was there, because people at first thought surely the guy must be joking. He was not joking. And this is, of course, what we found with President Clinton, that, when Webster Hubbell, who was third in command at Justice, was tasked by the president to look into, he was asked by the president, this is in his book, you can read it, Friends in High Places, where he was asked by Clinton to look into two things. Number one, who really killed Jack Kennedy? And number two, what is this going on with UFOs? What are they and what's happening?
Right.
And Webster Hubbell basically came back and said, in the book he says, we were not happy with the answers. To people on my team, he said very directly, we knew we were being lied to and we're not idiots. But they never got any answers. And actually this is, I didn't know all that. I mean, you can imagine, here I am, I'm a 35-year-old guy or whatever it is, briefing a CIA director and trying to put together this best available evidence packet for the President of the United States. I mean, I'm working as an emergency doctor with 4 daughters and a golden retriever and a house.
Right.
I'm a little... Well, first of all, I have to say I was very skeptical when my point of contact to the CIA director sent me a FedEx saying, you will be the first person to brief the Clinton administration and the CIA director on this subject. And I just laughed. My wife and I looked at each other and said, what baloney? And I thought that I was being asked up there just to share what I knew, because they wanted to pick my brain like, spies like to do. But when we had the dinner and we had the discussion, it was clearly evident that the CIA director did not know and was being denied access, and he was very upset about it and very mad about it, and that this was something that was a complete breakdown in the constitutional and legal chain of command oversight, which is exactly what, go back 50 years, as Eisenhower was talking about in 1961 during his farewell address to the nation. And so you kind of go full circle, and it's nothing changes, it seems. But and actually, that was the impetus. I have to give people a little perspective. Between 92 or 3 and 2001, we did our best with the help of many people, but including and as one of the stars of this effort is Commander Miller here, who's on this radio show with me today, to brief the correct people in the Congress. I met with a number of chairmen of committees, members of Senate Intelligence Committee, members of the, all the ranks, foreign as well as domestic at that level, to encourage them to take the issue, investigate it, disclose the information, pave the way for peaceful contact with these civilizations, but also to pave the way for the useful energy generation technologies that had been studied and developed over the last 50 or 60 years to come out to benefit humanity. And what I found, I thought, now here was how naive I was when I was 35. I thought that if we provided dispositive evidence, proof, documents, testimony, photographs, that these people would then be able to just do it. But that's not the case. Knowledge does not mean access. And
exactly.
it took me a long time to realize someone may know about the subject after we provide. They may even have project code names and code numbers that I can get to them. But that doesn't mean that official or that president or that senator or whoever actually is going to be given access and control over that compartment in operation. Those are two separate things. And I remember a couple years ago we had a delegation come over from France.
Yes.
And these were actually quite high-level people, and one of them was very involved in putting together stuff for the French intelligence and Air Force and for their president. And it was kind of shocking to them to realize that you and I had these kinds of meetings over the years with people of that rank, admirals, generals, CIA directors, and that they didn't honestly know anything, and they weren't controlling these projects. And then I remember having to explain to one of them, look, we lose every year in our intelligence and Department of Defense and other related budgets, which is now going up towards $1 trillion a year, if you add them all together, Homeland Security, all that. Then we lose each year somewhere in the $100 to $200 billion that go into these compartments where no one knows where they're going, more than you or any other country in the world spends each year. So we kind of don't even know where that amount is going. That would equal the largest defense budget in the world if you were to look at the world totally. I mean, it includes China, Russia, and all of the countries in the EU. Yeah. So it was kind of an eye-opening but very disturbing experience for them, I learned.
And excess of potentially misused riches, Yeah, but once again, this money doesn't fall like manna. It's taxpayer dollars. Taxpayer dollars at work on projects that could potentially benefit mankind. And there's the issue of technology transfer, Over the years, I have come to believe that there is some of that technology in use by Department of Defense.
Oh, yes.
I'll give a couple of examples. I had a friend, a former military officer who worked with me, and this fellow was pretty unique. He was on track to be a NASA astronaut, and then he had that greatest misfortune of all misfortunes as a test pilot to have more takeoffs than landings. You always want those two numbers to equal out.
Right.
And unfortunately, he was in a couple of really bad crashes, no fault of his own, equipment failures. And last one nearly killed him, so it also killed his chances of being an astronaut. But as fate would have it, they gave him another high-level position, and that was to go out to the famous Groom Lake facility, Area 51. And he was out there for several years.
Right.
Now, as we all know, most folks that work out there have signed their lives away never to disclose what goes on, and for better or for worse, and this fellow was no different. And over the 3 years I worked with him, and he knew my interest in things extraterrestrial and my work with CSETI. Never once did he mention any of his work out at Groom Lake or any association between that and anything extraterrestrial. And the day I was leaving the command, he took me aside. He said, Will, some of the folks you talk with, maybe some CSETI researchers, may see objects that are doing, Mach 9 and then suddenly make a right angle turn. And you say, well, gosh, that's got to be an extraterrestrial craft. And then he looked at me and said, but it's not. And he just turned and walked away.
Correct.
So, that coupled with a couple of other incidences, one of which was another fellow who'd been out at Groom Lake who when I was leaving that command, said, "Bye, have enjoy your next assignment," and 5461. And I said, "Excuse me, what was that number, Bob?" He says, 5461. So it doesn't mean anything to me. He says, "That's the number of the program you were interested in."
Right.
And of course, as we talked earlier, most special access programs are either have a code name or in a budget line item just have maybe a 4 or 5 digit number.
Right.
So you add that, and then a final piece of data is a former director for procurement for the U.S. Army. And one late night on, I think it was a History Channel program about the Comanche helicopter, the follow-on to the Apache.
Right.
This gentleman who came on right at the end of the program, late at night, was only run one time. He said, the Comanche program is probably the last helicopter that the Army will ever buy. All follow-on craft will probably be anti-gravity craft. Well, that's just a statement to nearly blow you away from a senior procurement civilian across whose desk all programs would travel, to say that, one, we're already doing research and development on anti-gravity, or we already have it and we're just waiting to put it into a new craft.
Right.
And so, you add all those things together, you say, hey, there has been technology transfer, but has it benefited mankind in general? Absolutely not at this point. Should it? Maybe so.
Right. And this gets into the whole discussion of what happened in October of 54, because between 1947, when we formed the CIA and the National Security Act and all that, and 1954, there were accounts in the mainstream aerospace literature about electromagnetic gravitics, high voltage systems causing a reduction in mass and weight, et cetera, and so on. All of that went black, as it were, in October of 1954. It's my understanding it did because they figured out enough of it that they knew they were going to be able to make it operational, and that by the late 50s and early 60s, we had things up moving and flying around using that kind of technology, and now we're in multiple generations since then, because we're talking, 60 years later almost, certainly more than 50 years later. And so that is something that I've had confirmed to me from multiple independent corroborating sources. And so I tell people the good news is that these new energy and propulsion systems have been studied, developed, and already exist. The bad news, as Ben Rich alluded to, who is the head of the Lockheed Skunk Works, is that they're locked away in a black box, and it would take an act of God to ever get them out to benefit humanity. And I think that this is the big question: what comes out when? How can it be applied? And what are the defense applications for this? Because obviously, if you have an object that can go from here to Baghdad in 2 or 3 minutes. This becomes something that, if it was in the hands of folks who want to deliver a weapon here, would not be good. On the other hand, there are stationary technologies that have been developed for about 100 years that deal with new energy that would get us off of oil and gas and coal, which is creating an existential threat, not just environmentally, but geopolitically, as you have, people fighting in the South China Sea and what have you over oil reserves and supplies, and you have, billions of people in India and China who are now getting over 80% of their electricity from burning coal without scrubbers.
Yes.
It's just like the 1800s of the early Industrial Revolution. So, this sort of retardation of our technological evolutionary path that has happened because of the secrecy is something which is now becoming an existential threat to the Earth and to humanity. And so we're on the horns of a dilemma, which brings us to why we're trying to introduce all of this information in this film, Sirius. And I think that, of course, you can only do so much in 2 hours in a feature film for the mass public, but I think that we want to begin to expand that dialogue with the public in a way that has never happened, which is why we're working on that.
Yes. Well, even if you look at NASA's future programs, NASA's looking at all kinds of advanced propulsion systems. But wouldn't it be great if they could stop using 2,000-year-old Chinese rocket technology to launch rockets into space and have something that would be just a little more efficient, less polluting. You know, any person in the U.S. or any other country can look up in the sky on a clear day and see all kinds of vapor trails. Well, wouldn't it be great if that pollution wasn't up there too?
Well, and that's I always joke with people because I deal with a lot of high tech folks, and I said, look, you have smartphones and fiber optics, but guess what? They're being powered off a coal-fired power grid, circa 1800s.
Yes.
The airplane you're flying in is jet engines, which were actually developed in the 1930s. And rockets, okay, you're a rocket scientist. That's Werner von Braun for Adolf Hitler and the Nazis from the 1940s. And you have nuclear power plants, okay, but that's splitting the atom to create heat. So you have a steam turbine. What you're doing is actually heating water, creating steam to turn a turbine the way the old choo-choo trains did with steam engines.
Yeah.
And except in the byproduct, you've got this radioactive waste that's around for about 50,000 or 100,000 years. So in reality, there have been no breakthroughs that are meaningful for energy and propulsion since the 1940s. Now we're talking 70 years, for crying out loud. So, we've been sort of locked in this, we're stuck in this sort of cul-de-sac or cesspool going around and around in sort of an early industrial model on energy and generation, and yet we have the internet and we have billions of people wanting to have refrigeration and transportation and travel. This creates a real problem because we're running up against what we can do. Well, I think we may have lost Commander Miller. I just heard a beep, and so he's no longer there. We're about up at the end of our hour. Let me just wrap a couple of things up. I hope people have enjoyed hearing this from our senior military advisor for disclosureproject.org and cseti.org. Commander Miller will be making an appearance in the film Sirius, which is a groundbreaking event. I also want to share with people that we have heard from the senior scientists who are analyzing the possible extraterrestrial body. We have had it confirmed that specimen is in the 5 to 7 year old range and is not a miscarried fetus or deformed fetus of any kind. And if it's 6 inches long and it's 5 to 7 years old, this is world news. The holdup on finishing the film Sirius is because of the complexity of trying to set up a experimental model for doing the genetic DNA testing, which is being done at one of the Ivy League universities by a very senior PhD scientist, one of the most preeminent geneticists in the world, and who has really doing a thorough job of this. And so as soon as he can complete some of his preliminary work, it may not be a complete genome, we'll get that information and his interview into the film Sirius, and then hopefully we'll be able to bring it out. We're looking for it to come out this spring, so stay tuned. So anyway, hope everyone has enjoyed this interview. I'd like to thank Commander Miller. Seems like we've lost him right at the end of the show. And also I'd like to thank the people at the World Puja Network for hosting us here every 2 weeks. So keep looking up and stay tuned to next time. If you want to go back to our new website where you can access all these different, it's a portal for all our websites. It's SiriusDisclosure.com, SIRIUS, like the star system, disclosure, all one word, .com, SiriusDisclosure.com. All right, thank you very much. Bye-bye.
However, handling caveats, things like eyes only, so you can have secret eyes only information, secret ORCON, which is originator controlled. In other words, only the person who created the classified information controls who gets to see it.
Right.
Or ESI, especially sensitive information, or even no foreign dissemination. And then, of course, you hear the term cosmic, top secret thrown around, and the cosmic classification is a NATO unique classification. But all that aside, there's a major issue as to how secrecy is maintained in the military, particularly with respect to what we call special access programs, or SAPs. Now, you can have special access programs that have any number of classifications. Most of them are top secret, with some of the handling caveats that I mentioned earlier.
All you have to do is listen.
Hello, and welcome to Conversations with Dr. Greer. This is Dr. Stephen Greer, and I'm the director of the Disclosure Project and CSETI. And also, we're, of course, as you all know, launching this film, Sirius, which should come out in the spring of this year. So we're wrapping that up. And I'd like to thank the folks at the World Puja Network for hosting us here every 2 weeks to bring you up to date around the world with all the projects that we're working on. We have a new website where all these projects are being put under one roof, as it were, at least internet roof, and it's SiriusDisclosure.com. That's SIRIUS disclosure.com. So you can go there and see what we're doing with the film, see what we're doing with the new energy effort, disclosure, and the CSETI contact operations and programs. So out there in the public about secret programs, top secret programs, and as we'll get into, unacknowledged special access projects. So I'd like to thank Commander Miller for being with us today. Thank you, Will, for being here.
Well, you're very welcome, Steve. It's a pleasure to talk with you.
Well, why don't you? It'd be great if the folks listening would get a sense of the lay of the land. I think one of the things I want people to understand is how the government works, or as we get further into this hour, how the government doesn't work on certain issues, but how it's designed within the military and intelligence community in terms of classified programs. I wonder if you could just speak to that, because I know you have a great knowledge of it.
Sure, and there are a lot of misconceptions about secrecy and classification, particularly when it comes to this subject. First, there are many folks that would say, well, nothing should be classified. The government should be able to open all of their files and give us anything we want. And obviously, there is a need for classification, legitimate classification, for some programs to protect national intelligence information, and information, the disclosure of which would cause grave harm to the nation. We would not have wanted the Germans to get all of the information about how to build an atomic bomb. That could have been a grave problem in changing the outcome of World War II. But that said, you frequently hear folks talk about, well, this program must be above top secret. And actually, there are only 3 levels of classification in the military: confidential, secret, and top secret.
Right. And
those being made by an individual, by the classifier, based on certain criteria as to what kind of harm their release would cause to the government. And there are...
I'm very excited today to have with us someone who is, I think, probably the most important and special guest I've ever had on this program. And he's a man of enormous integrity who has been involved and assisted with some of the very important work Disclosure Project has been doing, and has been a great friend and ally for over 20 years. In fact, I believe we met in 1991. And his name is Commander Will Miller. He's a retired U.S. Navy officer. He is someone who has worked very closely with me to help bring the information about the UFO and extraterrestrial issue to some of the highest-ranking members of our military in setting up briefings and meetings here in the United States. And he's also been, I think, the most important advisor to the project in helping us understand how the system works and what the reality is versus the perception.